Now, this evening, our final speaker, and the last shall be first, Rabbi Bregman. He was not on the promo material just because we could not confirm at the time that he was able to come. But when he was able to come, I welcomed very quickly to have Rabbi Philip Bregman come and speak to us about the BDS movement and UBC. Some of you may have known or possibly have been following what had taken place in the University of British Columbia. And so Rabbi Bregman was right on the front lines, and he's very, very well qualified to speak on the BDS movement as well as what's taking place on the university campuses, specifically at UBC. So Rabbi Philip Bregman is now the executive director of Hillel BC, and he is the Rabbi Emeritus of the Congregation Temple Shalom. Would you please welcome to the podium this evening, Rabbi Philip Bregman. Welcome this evening.
Thank you. So a little Jewish boy and a little Catholic boy were very, very good friends, and they decided, they didn't know that much about each other's traditions, and so they decided they should go to each other's house of worship to find out a little more about their friend's religion. And so there was a Sunday morning, and the Catholic boy invited his Jewish friend to a Mass. And throughout the service, the Jewish kid would say, "What does that mean? And what does that mean?" They're talking about the sacrament, and he's looking over there, and that's a confessional, and so on. And it was tremendously instructive. Well, the next Saturday, the Jewish kid invited the Catholic kid to synagogue. And in the same way, the Catholic kid now is asking the Jewish kid, "Well, what's that?" "Well, that's the Ark, and that holds the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and what's going on here, and that's a prayer shawl," and so on. And then the rabbi got up to speak. And the rabbi took off his watch and put it down. And the Catholic kid said to the Jewish boy, "What does that mean?" And the Jewish kid said, "Absolutely nothing." I notice that I'm the only speaker here whose spouse is not with me. So I don't have any gadgets, and I don't have somebody going like this. Now, you have to understand, I came from Vancouver. It took me 6 hours to get here. I'm not talking for 5 minutes, people. When I say to you that I cannot really express my gratitude for you, you will perhaps understand that when I tell you a little bit of history about me. I was born the same year as the state of Israel. I'll be turning 67 in August. So I was born a few months after the creation of a third commonwealth called the modern state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael. And I was born in a small town in Ontario. At the time it was called Galt, and now it's called Cambridge. Galt, Hespeler, Preston, and so on. And I spent almost the first 9 years of my life there, and then my family, thank God, moved to the holy city of Toronto. It was during those first 9 years, and if we have any psychologists and psychiatrists, you'll know that these are very formative years. I was subjected to anti-Semitism on a weekly and sometimes daily basis. It's on this, as my growing up, I heard phrases like Christ killer, dirty Jew, and so on. I would be away for the high holy days. I would come back. My mother, Oliver Sholem, may she rest in peace, would give me a note to give to the teacher explaining why Philip was away for a certain day. The teacher would then read the note in the class and say, Philip was away for celebrating his Jewish New Year, you say, they don't follow our New Year, they have to have their own New Year. So the tone was set very, very clearly as I was growing up, and I was the only Jewish kid in my school at the time. What's interesting is that, and I'm not really sure why my parents ended up in this place. My father, of blessed memory, was born in Toronto, my mother in Hamilton, Ontario. But somehow they settled in this little town by the Grand River, opened up a little store, clothing store. I learned what it was like to be the other. Matter of fact, I didn't know any better other than being the other. When we moved to Toronto, I was amazed to find out that there were so many Jews in the world. I was now in a school which was half Jewish and half Christian. We got to high school. I found myself part of a Jewish group, and it was the case that we at times had street brawls. And I remember the first time that I was going to be involved with this group, and we were arranging where we're going to meet for this brawl, Jews against the Christians. And I turned to one of my Jewish friends and said, "This isn't fair." "What do you mean?" "Well, there were 12 of them and there were 10 of us." He says, "You're worried that there are 12 and we're 10? I said, "No. I'm worried that I'm involved in a battle right now that is not myself against 2, 3, or 4, but it's not fair for them. We're 10 and they're 12. It's not fair to them." I learned what it was like to understand and feel the insults and the hurt. My wife and I arrived in the Lower Mainland in Vancouver in 1980. I was serving a large suburban congregation just outside of New York City. I was the assistant rabbi, 1,400 families. Came to Vancouver. I had my wife escape the United States. And we came to this small little congregation, Temple Shalom, which at the time was on West 10th, not too far from UBC. We started putting iron bars on our windows on the main floor. And we had completed 95% of the job when the Molotov cocktail on that early Friday morning of January 25th, 1985 came in and destroyed the synagogue. Thank God that no one was hurt. I know what it's like to receive death threats. I also know that my house is now tagged by the police, and I found that out when one night at the synagogue, some police showed up and said, "Rabbi, there's an incident going on at your home. Could you," it was after services, "could you please, you and your family, they're here?" "Yes." I said, "My son is out." Came home, and there was a SWAT team on my front lawn. I said, "What's this about?" And they said, "Well, your alarm went off." My alarm went off and a SWAT team is on my front lawn? When your name is Rabbi Bregman and we screwed up the first time, we're not going to let it happen another time. And I was tremendously appreciative. And I know that when the synagogue was destroyed, the very first person to show up for services, who then became a friend, was the mayor of Vancouver, Mike Harcourt. And he and Becky gave us the first donation for the rebuilding of Temple Shalom. I know what anti-Semitism smells like. I know what it sounds like. I know what it tastes like. And so I get now to this part of my life where, after 33 years as senior rabbi of Temple Shalom, I made the decision that I was going to retire. I was planning on doing other things, and then I was asked to please take over as the executive director of Hillel, which is the Jewish student organization. And we serve currently 5 different campuses, 4 in the Lower Mainland, 1 in Victoria, and we're opening up another one, a 6th one, come September in Kwantlen. We serve UBC, we serve Langara, we serve Emily Carr, we serve SFU, UVic, and now is going to be Kwantlen. And at the beginning of the 2014 academic year, we were beginning to get word that there was going to be a BDS referendum, in all likelihood, making its way to UBC. Let me give you a little bit of history about BDS, standing for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction. Or as my managing director says, it really stands for Bullying and Demonizing Students. That's what BDS stands for. So the BDS movement began shortly after the 2001 Durban Conference on Anti-Racism, which basically was an absolute hate fest against Israel. That's what took place. Israel and the United States walked out. Canada stayed at that point. It was not your government, it was not your party. But in subsequent years, Canada said, no thanks, we'll pass. It was during this period of time that a young man by the name of Omar Barghouti, a graduate of Hebrew University, Palestinian, took a page from Yasser Arafat, Yirmach Shemo, may his memory be obliterated. You know, it's funny, we Jews are strange. We say that, and yet we really don't want to obliterate his memory because we have to remember in order that it not happen again. But nonetheless, when we say names like Hitler or Arafat and so on, Arafat in the 1960s realized and came to the understanding that the Arab world was not going to be able to defeat Israel militarily. It just wasn't going to happen. And here I have to hand it to my foe. He decided that there would be another attempt to isolate Israel on the world stage, and that was to scratch the surface of Western Europe in particular, and to let the anti-Semitism, which was just under the surface, come up. And it wasn't that Europe was in love with the Palestinians. As a matter of fact, I'm not too sure who is actually in love with the Palestinians, because if they were, they would be helping the Palestinians towards statehood of a 2-state solution and not encouraging them to have this ridiculous notion of the extermination of the state of Israel. Nonetheless, Arafat knew there was an itch, and he put it out there, and they started to scratch. And that was the beginning of the anti-Israel movement in the 60s and the 70s, whereas James said that infamous resolution in 1975 came to the United Nations that Zionism is racism. And like a knee-jerk reaction, it passed. Ultimately, I must tell you, it was rescinded. The BDS movement, my friends, is not about boycotting anything. And our example at UBC points that out. Here is the wording of the referendum that was put out because they received 1,000 signatures in support of this, and the AMS did not have enough sense to shut it down, nor would the administration of UBC shut it down. And believe me, I was and continue to be in their face. You see, I'm not an employee of UBC, much to their chagrin, so they can't fire me. Here is the wording. Do you support your student union, the AMS, Alma Mater Society, in boycotting products and divesting from companies that support Israeli war crimes, illegal occupation, and the oppression of Palestinians? That was the wording that was put out there. Now we need to parse this. First of all, the referendum is a lie. Why? Israel has never been convicted of war crimes. So to talk about Israeli war crimes, you have a lie in this statement. On its face, the statement should never have been allowed to continue. Number two, do you get a sense of what products they're talking about here? No. Because neither the Palestinian group or the AMS would ever tell us what products they want to boycott. So I said, you're asking the students to sign a blank check without any understanding of what products. What kind of nonsense is that? This is to be a house of learning. This is to be a place where we have full disclosure. You're hiding behind this. Why would you allow this? Again, we got nowhere. I did notice one day, and by the way, from the moment that I arrived at UBC almost 2 years ago, I have repeatedly, as my student leadership has, to make opportunities of dialogue with the SPHR, which is the Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights. They have repeatedly told us we have a no dialogue policy with you people. We have been tremendously successful at Hillel, having all sorts of dialogue opportunities with other groups, including Muslim groups, the MSA, the Pakistani Student Association. Just recently, 2 weeks ago, we had a commemoration with the Armenian Student Association as they were looking for a place to commemorate their 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. And we, of course, said yes. And in 2 weeks, this next week, we are doing the second annual commemoration of the Rwandan genocide that is going to take place at Hillel House. I am the Jewish chaplain. The UBC chaplaincy, including the imams, including the priests, the ministers, the Baha'i, Buddhists, meet at Hillel for our meetings. We are always about dialogue, always. And yet we have been able to have a dialogue with the Palestinian group. So one day, while this referendum now is in full gear and there's going to be a vote taking place, I noticed that they were tabling at the sub, which is the student union building. And I went up to them. There was a crowd, and so they sort of had to speak to me because it didn't look good if they said, "We're not going to talk to you, Jew." And I noticed that they had 3 companies that they were thinking. I said, "Are these the companies that you're thinking of boycotting?" "Yes." I said, "Fascinating. Why?" "Well, the first company you have there is Caterpillar." Any idea why they wanted to boycott Caterpillar? Because Israel has caterpillars and at times has to take down homes of terrorists and so on. So they wanted to boycott Caterpillar. And I said, the student union is building a new sub. "Yes." "Do you know that the foundation was excavated not exclusively but primarily by cats, meaning Caterpillar machinery? So you're saying that the AMS will not be able to move into their new student union building?" They weren't thrilled. The second company they said they wanted to boycott is a company called Motorola Solutions. I said, "Perfect." I said, "Are you aware that Motorola Solutions is responsible for the operating systems of all Androids?" And by the way, Stock, I don't think it's an Apple you were showing. So that means that you're going to be telling all students who are using anything other than Apple that they can't use this on campus. They weren't thrilled. And now we get to my favorite company that they wanted to boycott, and I said, "Why Sabra hummus? You don't like the taste? What?" There are other, because it's an Israeli company. I said, "That's your reasoning?" "Yeah." I said, "Well, you're only half right. Why? Because in 2009, the Strauss Dipping Company sold 50% of the holdings of Sabra Hummus to a little American company called Pepsi-Cola. So if you're going to be boycotting Sabra, you in fact are going to have to be boycotting the majority of the machines that are already in the sub selling Pepsi and selling Frito-Lay and Doritos and so on. At that time, they told me to leave. We Jews can be very annoying. But here is now the point of what BDS is. They don't care about boycotting. They have no intention of boycotting anything. They're not going to be able to come up with products that will not bite them in their own butt. Okay? And we've told them, I said, here, we'll give you a list of companies. You want Israeli companies? You want North American companies? Which companies do you want to boycott? Here's some that we suggest. We suggest you boycott Google, you Intel and Microsoft. I mean, those are all major companies in Israel and the United States. So it's not about boycotting. What is BDS about? It's about intimidation, and it's about toxicity on campus. It's about isolating Israelis and Jews and making them feel less than. And I can tell you, after having come out of 5.5 months of battle in the trenches, and the BDS movement, while it got more votes than we did, it did not pass because it did not make the level that it needed to. It was brutal. And the swastikas are still there on campus. The statements were stinging. Were stinging. At an AMS meeting, somebody stood up. When one of the individuals on the student council, actually the ombudsperson, said that the gathering of signatures, the 1,000 signatures, were not always done properly. And there was intimidation and so forth. Somebody stood up and said the following: we know that Israelis lie. Therefore, how do we not know that the person standing up doing the intimidation was not just some Jew on campus? In that one statement, they crossed the T and dotted the I. And they made the connection very clearly that this is not about Israel per se. This is about every single Jew on campus. That's why this is so nefarious. Let me give you another heart-wrenching example. One of my groups, the Jewish Student Association, has for the past 7 years been having a program with another student organization in which we make sandwiches that are then delivered to the downtown East Side Gospel Mission. We are making sandwiches for the homeless. And this group said, because the week that we were going to be doing this program, and it was planned months ago, coincided with when the BDS referendum was going on. And at UBC, you have voting that goes on for an entire week, and it's done online. The group said, we are going to have to pull out. Why? We can't be seen as having to take one side over another. One side over another about what? Homelessness? We're talking about sandwiches. No, we're talking about the BDS movement. And my president of my Jewish Student Association looked into the eyes of the president of the other organization and said, are you telling me that you cannot be seen with Jews? And she said, yes. This is 2015. Though I think it's 1939 and 1941. I cannot tell you the depth of pain that caused and still causes. The AMS, their students, some of them have a brain in their head. Others were still searching. But what I'm terribly distraught about was the response of the administration. They said this is about free speech. And I said, no, it's not. This is about hate speech. Why are you allowing this to go forward? And I said to them, I want you to think about the following example. Humor me. Let's say, for argument's sake, the Musqueam decide they want a pipeline to come through Pacific Spirit Park through UBC. For whatever reason, they think it's going to be good for the economy, it's going to be okay for the environment, it's going to be good for business and everything else. And the environmentalists at UBC go nuts. And the environmentalists are so angry that they decide that they're going to have a BDS motion against the Musqueam Nation at UBC. And I said to the administration, tell me what world we live in where that referendum would see the light of day. Tell me a referendum that would be targeting gays or women that would see the light of day. Why must I continue to be the canary in the mine? Enough. Enough. So, my friends, well, the motion was defeated this time. I feel so much of my life out there is comparable to that game at the P&E called whack-a-mole, where you get a hammer and you hit it there, but it pops up here, and you hit it there and it pops up there. I don't know if this is going to come back. I am preparing that it will. And I am preparing that we're going to have to go through this again and again. And I'm sad to say that on the majority of places in universities throughout North America where BDS has been presented, it has passed. And it has created that toxicity. It has created that anti-Semitism. It emboldens the anti-Semites. You should hear what my students come in and tell me of what's going on in classrooms, being said by professors about Israel. In one instance, an individual came in, she was so distraught, she was just beside herself, and she said, Rabbi, I just can't go back to class. I said, how many classes do you have left? She says, I have one class left. I said, what was this course about? It's about human rights violations. I said, okay. We spent one day on South Africa, but an entire week on Israel. Oh, that sounds normal. Okay. And they're horrible, horrible things, and she gave an example. And I said, will you go back to class if I send one of my staff in with you? It was a class of 60, 70 individuals. Yes. So I took my managing director. Despite the fact that she has a master's, she looks as if she's 17 years old. And that master's is from Bar Ilan University in Tel Aviv. And the BA from the University of Oregon. And it's in education. And I sent that managing director in with the student, and I said, I want you to independently take notes. I was sending my staff in there to audit the last class. I got a text during the class in which my staff member said, this is worse than you could possibly imagine. You couldn't even begin to write this script of how off base this is and how prejudicial this is. So they came back, and I said to the student, okay, how would you like to proceed? Because you've convinced us beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is inappropriate. Do you want us to approach the professor now? She said, no. I've got one more paper that's due. I'm afraid that if I do this, it will affect my marks. She's a smart kid. Because we're dealing with humans. And no one likes to be called up short. And to think that that isn't going to have some residual effect, you're foolish. I said, okay. So it's the end of class. We can't do anything now about the class, unfortunately. They've all heard that poison, and I can't bring them back to have some type of discussion. That's unfortunate. But we can do something on a one-on-one with the professor. And the professor heard that she was upset because there were, other comments that were done during a TA with a teaching assistant in which when she was making a comment in a tutorial, the class said to her, "We don't want to hear from you." You have to understand, Jews are shut down on discussion in classes about Israel. I'm not talking about UC Davis. I'm not talking about Berkeley. I'm talking about here in British Columbia. So I said, okay, write your paper. Let's get the marks. And when all is done, I want you to write them back and say, I'd like to come in and talk. And I want you to tell them that you're bringing the executive director of Hillel with you, because I don't want there to be any surprises. So we came in, my managing director, the student, and myself. He started to argue, I really didn't say that. And I said, wait a second, you actually did say that. And they referred to the notes, and he said, well, how do you know? I said, because I sent this woman in to audit your class. And if you want, we can give you the audio version as well. It's bad enough if somebody is going to give misinformation. But to then say, it didn't happen, or disown it, this is supposed to be an educational institution. One of the statements that this professor said is that during the war in Gaza, Hamas simply sent rockets that were symbolic. At which time my student looked him in the face with tears streaming down her cheeks and saying, would you tell that to my cousin who was buried and killed from one of those symbolic rockets? So, I get back to my first statement when I tell you how humbled I am and how pleased I am to be standing and listening to you this evening. As Jews in the world, there are times when we feel very, very lonely. And I can tell you that that is not the case tonight. And I thank you, and God bless you.
My. Wonderful.